Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Felicity Ezewike. If you've waited to join us, we thank you for your patience. We are a news channel, so we take developing stories as they come. Again, thank you. Today, we're going to beam our spotlight on Africa's renewable energy drive. Without question, the continent grapples with the challenges of energy poverty, climate change, and sustainable development. In this mix, renewable energy has emerged as a critical component of our collective energy future. With abundant solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal resources, Africa has the potential to leapfrog traditional fossil fuel-based energy systems and transition to low-carbon economy. However, despite the vast potential, renewable energy development in Africa faces numerous challenges, including lack of infrastructure, high upfront costs, and limited access to financing. While Africa's renewable energy capacity has grown significantly over the past decade, with solar and wind power leading the charge, this is according to the International Energy Agency, IEA, the continent still lags behind other regions in terms of renewable energy deployment, and many countries are struggling to integrate intermittent renewable energy resources into their grids. As Africa continues to navigate the complex landscape of renewable energy development, our conversation today seeks to promote better understanding of the issues and challenges to demystify the subject of renewable energy in Africa while exploring strategies and opportunities in the transition towards a low-carbon economy. My guests, we have three of them today. We are going to have a 1 hour-long conversation in one slot today, as against this segment, because of the nature of the conversation. First up is President, Governing Council, Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Associations, Professor Magnus Onuoha. He joins us from Port Harcourt, Rivers State. We also have the South-South Coordinator, Yali RLC Alumni Association of Nigeria, Francis Eghehan. He also joins us from Rivers State. Energy Specialist, Oghosa Erhahon. I hope I got that right. Apologies. You are here in Lagos. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, we don't have Francis yet. As soon as we have him on, we will bring him on live to you. Let's start with you, Prof. What are the main drivers of renewable energy development in Africa?
Thank you. Just a point of correction. I couldn't go to Port Harcourt, so I'm still in Abuja. So
okay.
I'm Abuja, yeah. So the main drivers. We are looking at Nigeria's or Africa energy demand as of now is still urban biased. So you have more than 80% of Africans, or 70 or 80% that live in the rural area don't have access to energy. So an energy fulcrum is in terms of productivity, in terms of healthy living, in terms of improvement in quality of life, we need energy. So, and the grid system have collapsed. Within the countries of Nigeria, the largest country in Africa, about 240. This year alone, the on-grid system collapsed 10 times. So, and you can see a lack of dilapidated infrastructure and all whatnot made it imperative for us to design an alternative. An alternative has we found in renewable energy and energy efficiency sources. And within the context of renewable energy, we are looking at how to ensure there's an access within the rural areas, this access security in energy sources or energy demand. So the drivers because Africa has, in terms of energy demand, we have a whole lot Africa, as 54 countries, so to speak, we do not have more than 70% of Africans don't have access to electricity. So in designing the alternatives, and the anything in line with the global thinking, clean energy, renewable energy becomes the opportunity. And within the context of renewable energy, there are solar and wind, solar in particular, the technology is evolving. We live in Equator and Nigeria, so the opportunities are there for us to harness it. So it's important that, it's very, very important that in this era of climate change, like you said, in order to reduce emission, we need to move away from fossil fuel to cleaner energy. That's represented by renewable energy and energy efficient sources. However, that does not mean that we will dispense with non-renewable energy sources like the oil and gas, so to speak. But in the context of if the oil and gas must still stay within the loop of energy mix, the production must be clean. And that's why at COP26 in Glasgow, we brought in natural gas as a clean energy that will finance our sustainable future. And if we can have a decarbonized technology that is clean technology, there's nothing wrong. More than 80% of 70% of natural gas is clean. So, so the drivers, I would say,
okay.
Well, because of the fact that we do not have access to, in terms of access and security, we need to cover the space. We need to cover the whole gamut of the population, the African population. And we're saying that the off-grid, as represented by the renewable energy sources, is anything. So all right, I think it's emerging now.
I want to bring in Oghosa to also get her opening remarks, but I'm quite curious about you saying we might still have fossil fuel around for a longer duration. Maybe as long as we have the energy renewable going on. I will try before this conversation is over to get your thoughts on that a little bit extensively if we have the time. Also, despite the encouraging prospects, Africa faces several obstacles to successfully transition to renewable energy, and this is something that has been in the forefront of conversations. Highlight for us some of these challenges that is inhibiting, our transition to renewable energy.
Have come across in different spheres. The first being that, as a continent, we are currently not producing enough than we have to consume. That goes from agriculture sector to even water, and not to mind the renewable energy resources like solar turbines, solar panels, wind turbines, and the rest. Domestic manufacturing has hindered Africans' growth in a lot of different areas. So that's like probably the low-hanging challenge that we're seeing. The crux now remains that a lot of renewable energy sources that are implemented in Africa have to be imported into the continent. You're going against exchange rates. I mean, you take the pandemic for an example. When the pandemic happened, other countries were able to use kind of like storage supply for, warehouse supply of solar panels or, any operational materials that they needed. But a lot of countries in Africa were stuck because the pandemic happened and we couldn't import solar panels to electrify our cities that were in lockdown nonetheless. So that's probably like the low-hanging challenge. The other challenge would be around policy. The policies that operate for renewable energy or low-carbon energy technologies in Africa are very diverse. The reason being that the continent has solely thrived, as Professor mentioned, on on fossil sources for a long time. And a lot of these technologies require policymakers and policy enablers to understand the critical nature of technologies that have to come into the market. I'm going to take energy storage, for example. The kind of financing for deployment or investment financing for deployments that has to come into play for storage facilities require the government, first of all, to play a role in making enabling environments. So enabling environments could mean having less tariffs on imports, having more support on new technologies coming into the market. So those kind of enabling environments policies have to be a priority for governments. And then thirdly, just looking into things that are also challenging renewable energy accessibility is the knowledge and understanding for what exactly and why exactly we need to include renewable energy sources in our, energy mix or even towards climate change. The real reason is decarbonization. For the last almost 150 years, the whole world has survived on fossil fuel. We've seen the metrics of these increasing things like global warming, climate change, disruptions. But currently, Africa has a great potential to diversify our energy mix and actually take strengths really from what we call our natural resources besides what has already existed. So I would just say those are the three main challenges that are almost low-hanging, but also they need to be controlled of. So that's policy enablers from the government, domestic manufacturing, and then lastly, just more advocacy around why it's important for us to actually invest in renewable energy technologies.
Prof, I'll take it from where I was stopped. Policy coordination and regulatory challenges, primary barriers. Can we fix this? We know that we still lack a coherent framework for Africa, especially cross-border trade and integration efforts.
Right. That's interrogating the barriers. Of course, the risk analysis, policy issues and regulatory issues. Well, within the context of Nigeria, we have an Electricity Act now, 2023, but in my interest, you know that 90% of the production of that act is on renewables. But it's subsumed, and that's why what the National Assembly now is doing, they created a committee on renewable energy. Even though I made a provision, they said they should add energy efficiency because energy efficiency is part of energy, So that committee is looking towards, a result-oriented policy that will lead to a Renewable Energy Act, like it's obtainable in Ghana, in Rwanda, and some of these our African brothers. You see, the African Free Trade Agreement, the moment we have policy issues and laws in place, it is really going to deepen understanding and trade. So, like she said, there are political risks, there are climate risk, there's also regulatory risks. There's also, in terms of balance of payment, the dollar and its volatility, more than 80%, 50% of renewable energy, equipment are imported. So we need to de-risk that institution. We need to create an environment where developers will have soft landing. So we need to create, this institution that will help to nairanize, in quote, instead of dollarize the. So, and in fact, we did a study 2 years ago with the World Economic Forum, the Alliance and World Economic Forum. We interrogated 10 risks that has so far impeded access to renewable energy or clean energy, so to speak. So, well, we need to, policy issue has remained very, very critical. Most developers, within our alliance, we have made provision for, Nigeria should provide a soft landing for us, like what happened in the oil and gas, the so-called subsidy. But we don't need this, but let's have an enabling environment for us to really go into that business. I think government is doing, it's trying, but still a drop in the ocean. Like what happened in 2016 when they brought 14 PPAs, power purchase agreement for 14 companies that will be able to generate 1,250 megawatts of renewables as a mainstream investment in Nigeria. Well, it does show the government have taken the bull by the horn, so to speak. But like she said earlier, we still need to be intentional about moving toward this transition, from oil and gas to renewable energy. Look at what happened in the MENA region. MENA region were intentional. Middle East, another African country like Morocco, Algeria.
But is Nigeria really intentional? Is Nigeria really intentional about
this renewable energy?
Prof, I'm trying to interject. I'm sorry, I'm trying to interject. I'm trying to respond to some of the things you were saying. You talked about soft landing. I was going to ask you to expatiate, and you did. You talked about enabling environment. If we have time, I would also want you to speak on that. But I want to go to Oghosa to bring up one of the first things you mentioned when we started, and that is our infrastructure deficit when it comes to renewable energy. Oghosa, what's your thinking here? What is being done to fix this? Are we doing enough to try to catch up or we're just there, we've not even scratched the surface?
Yeah, are we doing a lot? It's a very subjective question. One thing that will just raise is that today the Lagos state government actually introduced their own electricity act. I just saw that a few hours ago, so that was quite interesting. This was something that the federal government had set out into place last year that basically said all states in Nigeria do have the accord to now go into demonstrating how they can increase electricity access in their own states, essentially. So Lagos State is taking up that role and said, we're going to do this. And a part of what I saw in the press release actually mentioned including more renewables into the electricity grid in Lagos State. So that's not being idle, that's kind of being more intentional. However, in the grand scheme of things, Nigeria has a net zero target for 2060 under the Buhari administration. That was something that was set into place. In that period, we've gone through the pandemic, we've experienced the industrialization that's happened, and as Prof said, but then we're also getting to a point where we're still not tapping into our infrastructure. As Prof mentioned, the grid has collapsed, kind of lost count now, but we've also had a very tremendous rainy season. We have one of the strongest hydro dams in the region. We're also actually seeing more households now actually manufacturing, having their own generators, if you like, from solar panels. So you've seen a lot of people like investing in solar panels in their houses, solar home systems in their houses. We have to now get to a point where everyone's generating their own electricity. How can we feed that into a grid that allows for the whole country to benefit from that? They have policy ranges that exist in countries like Germany and the UK called the feed-in tariffs. And what that essentially means is when residentials or economic clusters like the Apapa regions, like you probably are familiar with, are generating more electricity than they necessarily need, rather than wasting that electricity, finding ways to actually put that back into our national grids to actually then distribute to other regions that don't have either the infrastructure or don't have the access to financing for renewables can be another low-hanging fruit. And it's something that I feel like the Nigerian state has an opportunity to tap into. But again, not to say that things aren't happening, but again, I think we're trying to be too ambitious in what we can do when there are other low-hanging fruits that we can really tap into. Another thing that maybe I would add is the impact that comes from advocacy. I think right now a lot of people are panic buying when it comes to like solar home systems. People are like, oh, there's no light, I don't know what to do. However, there are more technologies that now support that. There's a system called mesh grids, which is obviously like the interconnected mini grids that exist, can obviously form a mesh in a region. That means that houses that are not using the electricity in one house can actually try and use that same electricity that's been generated in another house. Those kind of advocacy metrics are something that I feel if the government is not going to support infrastructure, they need to get to a point where they start getting individuals to see the strength in communal sharing, even when it comes to energy access. Just because we're not at a point where we're having electricity storage as a basic necessity, because storage is an important but a bit costly energy resource, but I think the government can do a bit more. We're trying to raise advocacy, not just for energy efficiency, but if you are going to go off the grid and use more renewables, you might as well try to have 3 or 4 of your neighbors come together and invest in a solar home system, and everyone having the same thing and generating more electricity that they necessarily need. So I think, the country is doing okay, but we can definitely do better.
Okay, I love it when, you give us so much information. I don't need to reference my questions, because one of the questions I put up, I was looking for it when you mentioned community-based renewable energy efforts, and I thought that was an important thing to highlight. But I want to go back to what you said about the announcement from Lagos State government. I saw it before I left the house to come to the office, but the one thing that came to my mind, I'll come to you, Prof. I just wanted to stay with Oghosa for a bit. The one thing that came to my mind was continuity. That was the immediacy of thoughts. One thing is to have a great plan, to say I've signed this into law. But what happens when this government moves? Are there concerns in that aspect, or do you think that Lagos State, like they have been doing in the past, will stand out in this effort to embrace more renewable energy?
Yeah, that's a good point. We're good for creating policies on this side of the world, and when it comes to continuity, it's something that we exceedingly suffer from. We've actually seen other neighboring states like Enugu and Osun State, which have actually posed into this act and taken advantage of this act. I don't think there's I don't want to speak too much about Lagos State right now, but I don't think there's an issue of continuity, because when investments come into play, especially in the energy sector, it's not a pay now, get results tomorrow. On average, investments in the energy space take at least a minimum of 6 months. You know, whether you're importing the solar systems or you're trying to put a new transformer in your estate, it's not an off-the-shelf priority. So those are investments. You have to get into power purchase agreements with investors. You have to get into the developers and distributors. It's a communal effort, again, if you like. So I don't necessarily think that when the papers are signed and the contracts are signed, that it would end with a change of administration. What could happen, and this is me speculating, what could happen is that a change of administration could make it harder for those contracts to come to fruition. I think that's probably like my only comment on that.
All right, Prof, I want to come to you now, and going back to what you said about Nigeria doing its thing. Nigeria had an ambitious plan to integrate nuclear energy into the energy mix, but that hasn't really come to fusion because, I mean, a lot of issues, political instability, economic issues, and all of that. Where I'm going with that is to juxtapose how Egypt is doing. In North Africa, Egypt stands out with its large-scale solar, wind, hydropower, and nuclear project. So I wanted to ask, what are they doing differently that maybe perhaps Nigeria, where we're domiciled, can pick a thing or two from? Because this country is lagging behind somehow.
The one word, capacity building, or two words, capacity building across the value chain. That's why I used to use the word intentional. You know, the Electricity Act, you know, it's in the under, you mentioned the drivers of renewable energy. One is on the capacity building, the ability to generate employment. The social component of social development is very huge. You have 1 megawatt of solar you deploy. There are over 3,000 jobs in the value chain. Okay, in terms of the artisan, the inverters, just the designers, you know, so that was what Egypt did. They took the bull by hand. I want to develop capacity. Whether you are into designing, solar designing, whether you're into engineering, solar engineering, whether you're into the artisans, even credit writing, climate financing. So you see, it's very critical. The number one driver of renewable energy is employment creation. Like I said, in the oil and gas, since it was created in 1956, we discovered oil. We have not employed 50,000 people, be it at IOC, indigenous companies, and all whatnot, in terms of entrance and exit, you know. But here, the IRENA has a prediction that the Africa in the next 5 or 6 years can generate 10 million jobs for the coming from renewable. So that was what Egypt did. They created capacity. Okay, and make sure that the local capacity, you know, and that really worked out. Egypt is generating 50,000 megawatts now, you know, and they're taking it to the grid as well, as the case may be. So it is what we should do. You know, we don't need to. When I see some of these brothers from Asian Tigers coming here with all the solar panels, I weep. You know, so we need to innovation. You know, I don't want to mention there are some young men who have far back 2012, they were able to discover that Yobe sand dunes is the best sand dunes in Nigeria, and they can use it to produce silica, which is a major byproduct of solar panels. So we need to build capacity, invest in innovation and research, and honestly, the access and security will be a given. So that was what Egypt did. That was what they did. And look, I'm talking about local content. You know, we don't need to have flying briefcase people coming from the shores, out of this country to say they want to build 100 megawatts of solar. With 100 megawatts, what is the we have you design integrated resource planning, and that takes me to Electricity Act, the subnational that have the power. It's only Lagos states, Osun, Enugu, and Imo, and some other few states that have been intentional about how to do it. but the states have now the capacity to, to have the supply because they don't have integrated resource planning. We need to each state must have that integrated resource planning across the value chain for you to really go into this energy management and all whatnot. But however, it is a good start that states are beginning to be showing conscious. I believe that the next step is for us to have an integration. We need to have the geopolitical zone now. Instead of going solo and all that, can the Southeast out of the 5 states come together to, by way of collaboration? Can South, the same thing? Can Southwest, Northeast, let's come together? That was what happened that was what has happened in Europe. In Europe, if there's a power outage in Belgium, France is there to show it up because of integration. Whether you are doing renewable, most of them are renewable. So there's no like power outage and all whatnot. So it's important that let's build capacity. Let's have up-to-date infrastructure. Let's create the risking mechanism where developers will have an opportunity to guard against the instability in the foreign exchange, so that the risk institution can come to say of a truth. Let us go and get this importation, and we'll pay in naira. And let's get a scenario whereby in the next 5 years, let's have an assembly plant. From our assembly plant, by 10 years, we'll be able to have manufacturing. These are what will create jobs for the country, and not
Prof.
Yeah.
I have plenty of questions just listening to you speak, but we'll have to go on a very short break. When we come back, we'll be talking about funding, the strategies that are being employed, because as much as we want renewable energy, we know that it is capital intensive, and of course the need to balance our economic growth and development with the need to meet our energy needs. We'll be right back. Do stay with us. Glad you're still with us. Let's go to Oghosa now. Where are we on funding? I hear a lot of talk about, getting funds from international organizations and some of the risk that is involved. Talk to us about how Africa is going about getting the needed funding to improve on this sector.
That's a very wide conversation. As you know, there are various types of funding instruments that are being opposed to. But I think what I would love to draw attention to is this M300, which is a recently announced, actually in September this year, recently announced fund bucket that plans to electrify 300 million Africans, really. And the first bucket of funding that has really gone out has been mostly from multilateral development banks. I think $10 million went out just as the fund was released, and that includes countries like Zambia up to Nigeria, as well as Burkina Faso and Chad. Funding buckets have been very available for the continent. However, as everything, nothing really comes for free. And I think at the end of the day, one thing that we are seeing is, as you've mentioned, before the break, was the issue of continuality, where there is funding, but we don't have the adequate resources or infrastructure to actually meet that. So some criteria that probably come into the continent require companies that are participating in those fundings to meet certain benchmarks. The Renewable and the Rural Electrification Agency of Nigeria, over the last and entirety of my career actually, has done tremendously well in dispersing fundings that come from the World Bank and the likes. But then on the other side, we're seeing climate tech funding, which primarily look into innovative technologies that are coming onto the scene. So you have recently a fund that I worked with out in East Africa that looked into solar panel desalination. So basically getting clean water from getting clean water from energy access, essentially. And the funding for that was that this was a new innovative technology that was solving some of Africa's critical issues, and climate funding, either through VCs, equity or debt funding or funding buckets, mostly in the global north, come into Africa and say, hey, prove this technology works. This is the incubation stage, and we're going to fund you to help this technology kind of scale. So this is the kind of funding that's coming into the continent. And as you know, as you've mentioned, even at COP29, a few weeks ago right now, there was also some funding that was initiated into climate financing. So there's always, if you could say, there's always going to be some bucket of money or bucket of, but how are African developers, how are African renewable energy technology providers meeting those criteria? Because an instance that's existed in the past is that the funding for Africa is available, but these are being executed or developed by international developers, so the money comes to the continent, but it still goes out, and that's also kind of like, as what Prof has mentioned, there's a capacity lag that we're currently seeing where we have technology or developers that come into the continent and there's just not enough inborn capacity development that's happening to make sure even when they leave and we're able to actually now learn from what has happened and then be able to seek our own funding ourselves. The topic of funding and for renewables is one that obviously I keep echoing, but I'm really excited for the M300 that is being led by kind of the Rockefeller Foundation, SE for All, Sustainable Energy for All, GIAP, and a bunch of others that have just come together and realized, what, we're now working backwards. They've now said they want to electrify 300 million Africans rather than saying we want to fund this amount. And I think it's just such an ingenious idea, and I'm looking forward to how that kind of unfolds over the next few months.
Okay, I'm curious as to, Prof, your thoughts on the contentious pledge at COP29 that African countries were not quite happy with. Add to the mix, while you're speaking on that, I also want you to talk about how African countries can balance the need for economic growth and development with the imperative of addressing climate change and transition to a low carbon economy.
Yes, honestly, what we are doing is mitigation action. You want us to reduce the emission. There are three components, three objectives, which any person who is investing in renewable energy, a developer, you are trying to have, and you're going to earn sustainable profit. Yes, also the social dimension, like the employment creation opportunities, and as well as environmental integrity, the planet conservation, protecting the integrity of the environment. So in terms of having access to financing, denying us that is the financing we're talking about now is not loan, commercial loan. Cannot take commercial loan. Now, what you talked about is grants. A whole lot of grants that will enable us to address also the social and environmental components of the business we are doing. So any person who is into this business and wants to go to bank to take commercial loan, he will not be in business. So that's why this asset to climate financing. Climate financing, you cannot have access to climate financing if you don't do renewables that have the ability to reduce the emission. That's emission reduction project, so to speak. So, and that was why we were crying, if you see the DG of NCCC, how can you say you've been a promise of $100 billion since COP15 of 2009, and you're still, an incremental, contribution. I call it incremental because it's just a drop in the ocean. So for the Africans that do not have, we have less than 3% emission, and we're much more vulnerable to the vagaries of this climate change. So climate financing, that's why one of the key things we took to COP29 was on climate financing. And that's why if you look at what our DG said, we're very, very unhappy that they refuse to get committed about it. And that's why Africans or the global south are still shouting that you must increase that climate financing windows, However, the climate financing windows, you must design your methodology. NDC must be very clear that this is the mitigation actions we're carrying, whether you're in the energy or here, or in the agriculture, or in the industry, or in the waste to wealth and stuff like that. So climate financing is very, very critical. Unfortunately, most of us here in Africa, we're still so fixated to the conventional way of doing things. Instead of moving away from energy transition, that's a transition right from time, the world in the Bible, from straw. There's time we used to use straw. From straw, we used to firewood. From firewood to fossil fuels represented by coal, and there to oil and gas. Now we're renewable. We need to transition. We need to transit and in line with the latest technology. So climate financing is very, very critical for us to drive this process. The climate financing is not about loan, conventional loan. It's about projects financing that will help us to emission reduction potentials of this sector as represented by renewable energy. I think Africa is still fighting. I was happy that Africa for the first time spoke with authority. In fact, I was impressed with our DG NCCC. They spoke with authority and they received wide explanation. And I think when we begin to speak, we will see our policymakers, coming out to say of a truth, we will no longer expect in the handouts once again. I think we're good to go. Like I said earlier, renewable energy is the window of just like she mentioned, whether it's geothermal, green hydrogen. Let's get the mix and let's have enough technology, know-how, capacity building for us to drive the process. That's where we are going. Now, with the moment to get it, we have a step to financing, no doubt.
Also, we're wrapping up now, and this question is going to go for the two of you. Reason is, I want us to see if we can, wrap up on a very optimistic note. What future do you see for renewable energy growth in Africa? And in order to achieve this, what urgent 3 actions would you, maybe 2 or 1, would you recommend in the short, medium to long term? If you can keep your response to 1 minute so we can have some time for the prof as well.
Looking forward to the next few years in Africa, have to be 2 things. The first being just the strength for green hydrogen projects. So if you're not aware, green hydrogen projects rely heavily on a rise and increase in renewable energy across the continent. And so not particularly to just Nigeria, but also we see Namibia, Morocco, Egypt, South Africa, Kenya, really just trying to upscale their renewable energy access in order to meet the global market demand for green hydrogen. So those are very exciting prospects, especially for us in the industry. Another would be around storage. So as you probably are aware, it gets to a point where the sun is always shining, the hydro is always pumping in some countries, but they are not able to actually either store the electricity or use it for other means. So there's a potential for energy storage across the continent in the next year or so, and I'm really looking forward to that. Suggestions I would give for this are just more advocacy. I think a lot more stakeholders in the utilities, from the distribution side to the operation side to developers to finances, there just needs to be more advocacy. And if there's anything, the Prof and his council do so strongly is trying to route people on to understand how best their technologies, their problems, their ideas can come together through more close-knitted collaboration. And I think that's just more that needs to happen across the continent.
Prof, over to you. Prof?
Okay, the policy issues are policy issues. We need to tighten up the policy issues, strengthen policy issues. And the second one, it has gone beyond solar home system, to utility scale projects for us to have access, utility scale, mini grid. I look forward to seeing communities having access to building mini grids, and also you have energy hubs. So that's in the immediate strengthen policy. In the medium term, they'll begin to have utility scale, move away from solar home system, clean cooking stove. So mini grid starts to have enough access. Then the long run, I look forward to a situation where we have manufacturing, most of those products that are being imported, that are being manufactured here, so to speak. That's the scenario, the short term, medium, and long term. So create a scenario, and that's why we talk about plan. 2050, 2060 as our net zero plan. So capture everything into our net zero plan, so to speak. I think if we are intentional about it, moving away from the entrenched system, being a cog in the wheel of renewables. If we dispense with it, Nigeria is on the way to Eldorado. Or indeed Africa.
I want to thank you both specially for speaking with us today. This conversation has been insightful for me. Thank you for sharing your time with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Thank you, Zuke. Thank you for giving us this time too.
Also, thank you too. We're unable to have Francis on today, but you both held the fort quite beautifully in my view. Thank you again. And to you, our viewer, thank you as always for being here. Don't forget to share your thoughts and comments using any of our social media platforms. That's @NewsCentralTV. Until next time, do what you can, where you're at, and hope for the best. You take care.